has been generally an approach that this country has taken, unlike many others, of a contract-by-contract based approach to industry. This cannot work, and if we want to leverage in higher levels of private investment into defence, which we have to do, and as a government we are looking to do right across the board, then you have to be willing to have a long-term relationship and a long-term strategy, which we've said that that's what we'll do. And it's part of the government, as a new government, offering, if you like, a new partnership between government, business and the workforce and trade unions. We can do that. In defence, we have a particular opportunity to do that with our workforce. Uniquely for the private sector, the level of unionisation in defence is 38%. So there's a great deal of potential and an appetite for that. I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that we've too often been blind as a nation when we are looking at procurement about where the jobs, where the economic benefit lie. And I think we need to do more to recognise that defence has a vital role, not just in strengthening our security, but boosting our economy as well. So you will secondly see, under this government, a recognition that where we can, we should look to develop our own British jobs and support British-based companies. The third, I think, then, is another lesson from Ukraine, which is when the pace of technology development and the nature of warfare is changing so rapidly, you simply cannot have a procurement system that may take several years even to get to the point of contract. And that therefore it's the nature of the relationship and it's the characteristics of the industry, including more use of many more smaller and more modest-sized, medium-sized companies that are often much more flexible and innovative, that have to be built into that industrial base, the industrial strategy, and the changes in the procurement system that are needed.
Would you agree then that we're still some way off being able to replenish our current stockpiles?
Yes.
And how?
Yes, and it's look, to be fair, if I may, just to the previous government, it's why they said, right, we need now a 10-year strategy to do that.
How long do you think it'll be before we get to a position where I'm not going to suggest we'll be satisfied completely, but where you're more comfortable with the situation?
Well, General Rob, this is your area.
Well, I mean, I just had a couple of things to what the Secretary of State said, Mr. Wing. I mean, first of all, in terms of that long-term demand signal the Secretary of State was talking about, I think we are better now. Let me give 2 or 3 examples. So we've now formally signed up with MBDA for 10 years. They know they're going to get £6 billion of investment from the UK government to do exactly what you're talking about. We can go through those munitions if you wish. You've named one already in terms of, or you've named 2 in terms of Astra and Storm Shadow.
Yeah.
That's what I think the Global Combat Air Programme, GCAP, is absolutely central to the UK's defence industrial base, from a combat air, jet engine, missile, sensor capability, and that is a very long-term.
So the question that was referred to you by the Secretary of State was my question about how long.
So that's the munitions strategy, which is available, and the munitions plan that underpins it, which is secret, outlines the types of munitions that we need to invest in above the programme of record and when they will be delivered. That document exists and it's a secret.
Thank you very much. We'd now like to delve into
the classified briefing. Can we discuss that then?
Can we see that document when we have the classified briefing?
Let me have a look at the level of classification on that. It's not automatic that I can share everything that the committee might want at every level of classification.
Can I just have one other? Sorry, Secretary. Can I just have one other thing, and that this expression "always on," and "always on" is a critical part of the response to the issue associated with our munitions resilience, and that's the ability. What we don't want to do is produce a surfeit of munitions which then run out of what we call calendar life. And we need to be able to create a system where we turn to industry, whether it be Thales or BAE or MBDA in the particular case of the UK, and say to them, I want you to ramp up by X% within 2 months. We don't have that capability at the moment, and that is central to the munitions strategy, the so-called always-on approach. That is a significant change.
And I also want to add an upbeat note to this, which is we can do this. And it's not just the Defence Department and the military, but the industry as well. If you look at the NAO report recently on Task Force Kindred, it demonstrates that we can do things differently, we can do it rapidly, we can meet the demands of supporting, in this case, Ukraine in conflict, and we can take some of those lessons into our own system and learn from it. That's the challenge with a new defence industrial strategy.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now move on to the future of parliamentary scrutiny and the equipment plan. Fred Thomas, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary of State, you are a champion of parliamentary scrutiny. But last year, the MOD didn't publish, or partially published, an equipment plan which should give insight of £300 billion worth of spending over the next decade. Are you able to commit to seeing that the MOD does publish that this year and every year that you are the Secretary of State for Defence?
You clearly see I may regret saying I'm an advocate of strong parliamentary scrutiny. Well, my colleagues may want to reflect on last year's equipment plan. At the moment, for this year, with the Strategic Defence Review underway, it's unlikely that we'll produce an equipment plan in the same way for this year.
Okay.
Do you want to add anything for the last year?
We know the letter that came in from the Minister to the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee. I think this is an issue that we'll be coming back onto.
So there's absolutely an intent to return to publishing the equipment plan and getting the National Audit Office to review it and produce a report if that's what serves the purpose of parliamentary scrutiny. Some of the conversations we had with your sort of predecessor committee and with the previous Public Accounts Committee is that a snapshot of where our planning round gets to, by the time we produce a publishable summary, it gets into in-depth audit by the National Audit Office, is that we're essentially having scrutiny a year after that equipment planning round has concluded. And I think there is something about what is both the granularity of information, but critically the timeliness of information that actually supports the work of this committee and allows us to demonstrate actually where taxpayers' money is going in order to deliver the capabilities that our armed forces need for the future. And so whether it is simply a return to what we have previously done, or my ambition would be, can we do this better? And it may be that we don't simply want to look at the equipment plan, but at broader investment, including infrastructure. I mean, so I think there are some choices and views from the committee on what would be helpful to you as we think about how we come back to this, as the Secretary says, post the SDR, with a SDR concluding next year and the spending review, being able to set out then the plans this government has for the rest of the Parliament. Absolutely up for publishing something that is helpful.
Okay, thank you. To continue on parliamentary scrutiny, we're able to ask you an array of questions, some of which you can't give us the answers here because they're a high classification, we understand that. In other Five Eyes friends of ours, parliamentary establishments, they will be able to ask about about their respective special forces activities. Now, in the UK, we can't do that. I'd like to ask you specifically about the parliamentary side of things, not to comment on anything relating to UKSF in terms of organisational, operational, training activity, specifically on parliamentary oversight. Secretary of State, do you think that we have got enough scrutiny over UKSF?
I, at present, want to allow a really important inquiry that Haddon Cave is leading to complete its course and conclude. And I think that's the moment at which there may be a case for returning to these sort of questions.
Okay, thank you for that. And can I ask for yourself, Mr. Williams, you're the Permanent Secretary. You've previously been a Director General in different departments. You have held a lot of risk. From your understanding of Whitehall, and having obviously seen other departments being scrutinised in Parliament, do you consider that the MOD is holding risk by not allowing UKSF to be scrutinised in Parliament?
Holding risk. Well, I mean, as the Secretary of State has said, I mean, I think generally speaking, the department is better for parliamentary scrutiny, but that needs to be within appropriate parameters. And I think, as the Secretary of State has said, we will come back and look at that particular question once the inquiry into Afghan events has concluded. So I don't think, I mean, in the end, that will be a political decision, and no doubt we will have a conversation about it. But it's really a matter for the Secretary of State with my advice, rather than for me to offer an independent view, I think.
Thank you. Secretary of State, so are you implying or suggesting potentially that once the Haddon Cave inquiry resolves, you would be open to reassessing how this country scrutinises UKSF? Is that what we understand?
I'm not implying or suggesting anything at this point. I'm saying what I said a moment ago, that that will be the point at which to turn our attention, in my view, to these questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd now like to move on to operational aspects. So in terms of operations, if I can please call Calvin Bailey.
Thank you. Secretary of State, as I mentioned earlier, I think some of the decisions made yesterday were essential, and it's really good to hear the defence reform is underway. As if you were to use an analogy for an athlete, you would highlight the fat that it needs to cut away before you start the training programme, and hopefully that fitness programme is the SDR. But I wanted to focus on the decisions that relate to overstress and your ability to build capacity within the armed forces and to meet its commitments in terms of, obviously, NATO first. So on the 11th, you stated that there was 10,000 personnel deployed on 50 operations around the world. What percentage of the fighting force does this represent, and is that a sustainable ratio?
Rob, can I ask you to deal with this first?
Yeah, well, thanks, Secretary. Well, we'll have to come back to you on the exact percentage, unless David, the Permanent Secretary, has it. Yes, it is sustainable.
Not.
We'll answer that question in terms of that specific data point. But the answer to your question is yes, we can sustain the current operations that the Secretary of State has outlined. We look at readiness, though, through three lenses. This is what you're talking about. Are we ready to continue to deploy in the operations we're currently doing? In terms of capability, availability and sustainability, we can go into those three if you wish, but it's a combination of those three things, and it's a complicated formula that ensures it. But a direct answer to your question is, can we sustain operations today against the current laydown? The answer is yes.
I mean, if I may just come in, so we've talked quite a bit in this hearing about recruitment and retention. I think to get to the heart of your question, one of the other important metrics that we track is whether personnel are medically fit to deploy. So this autumn, the figure of regulars who are classed as medically fit to deploy is around the 100,000 mark. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily there are indeployable roles in the jobs or trades that they're currently in, but that is about 80% of the strength of the regular armed forces overall. So medically limited or medically not fit to deploy is a margin that we are looking to tackle, as well as work on recruitment and retention.
Okay, so I was employed to look at ACS as
you were. That's
indeed.
why I mentioned it.
Absolutely, and I would love to delve into that, but the committee wouldn't. So I think
being part of the team,
it's probably quite important to recognise that there isn't recognised readiness policy that's out there, and the numbers, and I think we would welcome a written response in that regard. But I think looking at that ratio, it's quite high, and also the number of countries that you are committed to is quite high. So I'd ask directly, out of those personnel, or how many of those operations would you align to directly the defence of the UK and NATO first?
No, look, I'm hesitating only because those two lenses are not something that I've applied to that sort of broad figure. So I simply couldn't give you an answer to that directly. It's a very specific question.
Let me go back to what we said before, that through the defence review, and you've used the expression yourself just a couple of minutes ago, that running through that defence review is NATO first. And we're working very closely with NATO on the meaning of that through the review. But there are other things that the nation has to commit to as well, whether it be in support of the homeland, whether it be broader global operations that you've deployed on yourself, or whether it be, as I mentioned, fighting in the grey zone. So I don't think it would be easy for us to do a defence review and just target those areas associated with NATO. But unfortunately, as you well know, the strategic landscape is much more complicated than that.
No, and
there's also a really important element of, if you like, military-to-military relationships and defence role in diplomacy, and the exercise of UK interests and influence around the world.
But those things aren't necessarily owned by your department, and those costs should maybe fall outside of the department. What I'm trying to kind of highlight is what was in the readiness for war paper, that is the hollowing out. It's been mentioned in here a number of times, so we know that part of the force which is committed to, you've assured us that that's going to be there, those people are at readiness, but the amount of people that are training and on their wind down, that's got to be where that residual capacity comes from, and there is very little description or discussion that shows how much of that has been hollowed out to maintain that wedge forward. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get after, because the recruitment and retention problem points to people being overstretched somewhere, and we're just not seeing adequate detail or information of why.
Well, we have, I don't disagree with you, but it's that our look at readiness is, as you know, is much broader. And one of the propositions that we've committed to the independent review team is on readiness, and to use your expression, it isn't called this, but to use your expression, hollowing out. And this cycling of people is one factor, but there are many others that we look at in terms of whether we have enough niche cadre skills that we've talked about earlier, whether we have the medical support necessary to warfight, whether we have the communications architecture that is survivable in a warfight. There are a whole range of things, but what you point out is one, but I wouldn't put it as one of the top 3 or 4 that we're really focused on in terms of readiness. We think we've got the right resilience within our workforce, assuming we address the recruiting and retention issues that we've been talking about before.
I think, if possible, we'd welcome some data on the number of non-formed unit deployments and what percentage of the deployed force that forms, because that's where a lot of that damage is done. And moving on to Ukraine and our support for Ukraine, this particularly impacts the Army and the Army's ability to work in that readiness mechanism. Can you provide a percentage of the Army that's currently committed to this effort, and how that would be impacted were there a change in the geopolitical situation that means we need to perhaps shoulder a bit more than we are presently?
You were talking about Interflex, I assume.
Well,
so again, I haven't got a percentage for you, but you raise a good point, that through and we've got this, through the Defence Review and through the independent team reporting to the Secretary of State, we've got to provide them advice on our future commitment to Ukraine, which is clearly ironclad, how much of that is going to be force driving. So in other words, the structure of the armed forces, not just the army, but across all the services, how much of that would be dedicated to an enduring campaign in Ukraine, as opposed to then conducting these operations in addition to other commitments they have. That process, and the point you raise, is something we've absolutely identified, and we need to give advice through the SDR.
Okay, in the round, and I'm conscious that we have other things to go, I'm applauding the honesty that brought out highlighting a whole load of equipment programs that should have gone a long time ago, and I would just like to investigate like how much honesty we feel that the military has in terms of toning down what it's doing so that it can develop the capacity to be able to build the resilient plan that the Defence Secretary would like to see in SDR.
Well, that we need to, and we are, central to deterring major state-on-state aggression is a robust and frequent and regular, at the right level, exercise programme, both individually and collectively, up to the various collective training levels, up to collective training level 5. It's absolutely central that that's a central part of our deterrence posture, and to ensure our forces are ready, but also to ensure that we're shown to be ready, and that will be. I mean, that we're already doing that, and we've, Steadfast Defender, which was earlier this year, is one of the most significant NATO exercises of some time. We will always be able to commit to that.
Secretary of State, would you like to see perhaps less of your resources being reused for Foreign and Commonwealth Office defence engagement so that they can focus on the stuff that only the military can do?
No, I'd like to be able to make more of the extraordinary network of defence people in uniform and civilian that we've already got, and I think there's a great deal more we can do alongside the FCDO.
Sorry, Chair, can I just come in on this really important point that General McGowan made about whether our support to Ukraine becomes force driving in the SDSR, because we have seen some evidence that the training that we have been providing Ukrainian forces is falling short because we can't replicate the combat conditions in Ukraine, specifically the utility of mass small drones. And there's also an issue over we can't dig Soviet trench systems on Salisbury Plain, apparently.
That was a point made to us by a delegation of Ukrainian MPs when they met up with the Defence Committee members as well, along with other concerns which I have relayed to the Secretary of State in the Chamber. But yes, a response to that would be much appreciated.
We'd be really keen to see that and respond to it. Yeah, that's great feedback.
We have actually shifted over 165,000 tonnes of earth to dig trenches for Interflex, which is not a bad start. But I take the point.
If you're getting feedback that we're falling short, we want to meet that challenge.
I'm sure committee members will do that. I believe Mike Martin wanted to come in briefly there as well.
Really, really quickly on this global deployments, and I think this clear and present danger from Russia versus global expeditionary military is one of the big questions that clearly the SDR is grappling with. But in the light of that clear and present danger, and in the light of the changed strategic context because of the US election, do you still think it's appropriate that the carrier strike group spends 4 to 5 months on the other side of the world next year?
I think there's a great deal of potential value in the carrier strike group undertaking this tour. There is military and exercising advantage. There is alliance building and consolidating advantage. There is economic and diplomatic advantage as long as we plan it properly.
Can I also add?
You do understand the point I'm trying to make, which is that all of those advantages could be had in the Baltic or the North Sea with allies that we might have to fight with in the near future.
Well, you wouldn't be able to exercise with the Australians or the Japanese or the Koreans or the extent of the US in those different parts. So you could not replicate the extent to which part of the elements of the carrier strike group tour is planning. So there is a value, otherwise I would not be sending it.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to move on to GCAP, the Global Combat Air Programme. Michelle Scroggle, please.
Thank you, Chair. Briefly mentioned GCAP earlier, the General mentioned it, and obviously the Prime Minister's mentioned it recently too. But can you confirm that we're fully committed to it and that funding will be available and released as it is needed?
We are committed to it. It's a really important programme. General Robb has underlined that. The Prime Minister has said we're committed to this. Clearly we've got the Strategic Defence Review underway, but I've made it my one of the areas of my major focus in 4 months in this job to maintain the momentum in that programme. A number of meetings with my Italian and Japanese counterparts, and the areas that I've been most concerned to maintain the momentum has been the completion of and passage of the treaties through all three parliaments in order that we can set up the joint governmental office, which we've been able to confirm this week we will do before Christmas, and that'll be in Reading. And to maintain the work with the three leading companies to set up a formal joint venture. That I expect to be in place before Christmas as well. These are the foundations which are innovative, and they are they're essential foundations, but they're also the hallmarks, I think, of a programme that is maintaining momentum and therefore the best chance of successful delivery. And that's been a concern, especially for the Japanese as well as the Italians as well, and mine. So yes to the commitment, yes to the momentum, yes to the importance of this as long term, both to meet the emerging threats and technologies that we can see in the mid and late 2030s, but also, as General Robb I think put it, it's fundamental to our industrial base in this country and to maintaining what has been for decades, which is a world-leading global air combat capability and technologies in Britain.
And you mentioned earlier about retaining those capabilities, the industry base and the staffing. Where does Typhoon fall into that category? And your thoughts on GCAP going forward?
Well, perhaps General McGowan can talk about Typhoon from a military capability point of view, from an industrial point of view. It's an essential part of a thriving, flourishing and very productive industrial base that we've got in this country. And really important that we do our bit to make sure as ministers and as the UK government that we're able to secure fresh orders for Typhoons to keep that base going. And as it happens, I was in both Turkey and Saudi Arabia last week. I met both defence ministers, and the opportunity for those countries to take advantage of Typhoons was a significant part of our discussions.
Well, as you know, Typhoon is GCAP replaces Typhoon. The industrial hinterland, if you will, that are matched between Typhoon and GCAP, from British Aerospace to MBDA to Leonardo to Rolls-Royce, etc. As you know, we are retiring our Tranche 1 Typhoons in 2027, but we are spending a significant amount of money to increase the capability of the Tranche 2s and 3s, which will make them world leading, even though they're fourth generation. We're doing that to ensure that they can meet the operational challenges through the 2030s. As the Secretary of State said, GCAP will start to come online in the late 2030s, but we're very confident from an operational capability perspective that Typhoon will be in the fight all the way through to GCAP coming into service.
Thank you very much. Just going back to the US Secretary of State.
We're going back to?
Going back to the US, if I may. Do you feel that the US election result accelerates the need for a larger defence spend?
No, I feel that the case for increasing the defence spend is there. It's why I recognised and argued for it before the election. It's why, as a new government, we've made that commitment to doing so. And I'm quite sceptical of sort of sweeping statements, if I may, Mr. Martin, that somehow the election result changes the strategic global context. I think we need to wait to see what the policy, military and strategic definition of the new president and the administration will be, and we may get a limited idea of that, certainly before the 20th of January.
Thank you very much. And also, just there is a principal concern amongst many defence experts that an incoming Trump administration may make certain decisions around supporting Ukraine independently or in a hasty manner with little consultation with allies and partners. I'm just referencing with regards to the Doha agreement that was made with Afghanistan. So in that eventuality, are we fully prepared to continue supporting Ukraine, and have we made contingency plans around that?
Partly as an extension of the point I just made there, I think it's not productive to try and talk in hypotheticals until we're clear about the approach the new administration may want to take on a number of fronts, including on Ukraine. But I and this as a government are very clear, as we've done this from day one, and I was in Odessa on day 2 in this job with President Zelensky, confirming that from that point on we were stepping up support, which we're continuing to do. Look, our job is to, in my view, is to rally allies as best we can, but also to continue the proud leadership the UK has had from the outset of the Russian invasion, of leading support for Ukraine and making sure that, particularly in this period where Ukraine is under significant pressure, that we do everything that we can to ensure they're in over the next 2 to 3 months, that they are successful on the battlefield, and capable of withstanding the Russian pressure, so that if President Zelensky and the Ukrainians decide there is a point at some point that they want to start the talking, our job will be to support them in any of the negotiations, just as it is with the fighting.
I believe my colleague Alex Baker wanted to come in briefly on this.
So, from everything we know and everything that you've told us today, the current threat is quite sobering. You touched in your opening piece around some of the work you're doing to, make sure that Parliament understands the situation we are in. What is your plan in terms of having that conversation with the great British public?
There is certainly, obviously, a role for government and a particular responsibility for the Defence Secretary, but I think our Parliament on all sides has a role, for instance, in Ukraine, to help people see as clearly as possible a number of things. First, that the Ukrainians are fighting for their sovereignty and their right to territorial integrity, and they have that right under the United Nations Charter. But they're also fighting for the same values that we stand for: individual freedom, long-term peace, and as a country a right to decide their own future. The second thing I think that it's important that we help people see clearly is that if Putin prevails in Ukraine, he's not going to stop there. And so for us in the UK, the first line of defence of the UK starts in Ukraine. The third thing I think is that it's a good example where, in this day and age, the strength of our allies matter, and perhaps matter more than they've ever done. And so I see a particular responsibility myself, and I know that many parliamentarians also share that responsibility, because if we are going to encourage the public to understand the decisions we have to take as a government and as a parliament, that explanation is part and parcel of what we need to do. And if on Ukraine we want the British public to maintain the extraordinary level of hospitality and support they've demonstrated to Ukrainians that are in the UK and to Ukraine as a country, that is not something we take for granted. And unless we nurture it, we could see it wither. And we've seen this in other countries where Ukraine starts to become a matter of public criticism, or Ukraine and support for Ukraine starts to become a matter of party political argument. And I'm really proud that this is still a country that from the outset, as we have, stands united for Ukraine and our support for Ukraine remains steadfast too.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. And finally, may I request, with respect to the Armed Forces Commissioner, and this was deliberated upon within the Chamber, if a written response to our committee's concerns with a response to that letter, if that could be forthcoming, that would be greatly appreciated as well, so that we could have that on the record with respect to the Armed Forces Commissioner Bill. And on time, I would like to convey my gratitude to fellow committee members who, despite various questions, almost in terms of military discipline, we've managed to finish on time. I was getting worried halfway through the session as to whether that would be happening. But thank you also very much, Secretary of State, to your good self, to Mr. Williams and General McGowan, for your time, your valuable time, as well as your valuable input. I'm sure that those within the wider defence community and the country would have been very, very grateful to hear those responses. And thank you for appearing before the committee, and I look forward to our future interactions. Order, order.